So at this point, you will have explored some of the material on transmedia, and it's kind of cool, no? I think it is, simply because of its power to captivate. When you were working through Lance Weyler's material there, and maybe you spent some time exploring the truth about Marika, hopefully you began to see how experienced designers can merge reality with fiction. The audience is not passive, and I'm hesitating to use the word audience here because of the connotations the word brings. An audience somehow implies their passive presence. They are watchers, where the extent to which they become involved in the story is at cognitive, physiological and neurochemical levels. Now, that's not to undermine their power. We've seen, for example, how some story designers do this very well by manipulating our emotions. Cast your mind back to the first audio story that I asked you to listen to, The Living Room, for example. How many of you felt a lump in your throats or shed a couple of tears, and yet the story was only being told through sound? Although you were invited to engage and connect, you were still a passive listener. But in transmedia, the audience becomes participatory. They contribute themselves to the experience and they become immersed in the story. Lines between reality and fiction become blurred. And this seems to perpetuate even more engagement. Maybe something to think about there for your assignments. What I'd like to do for the remainder of this audio is two things. First of all, I'd like you to think back to the transmedia case stuff that you explored, but this time I want you to think about the concept from a more practical or tangible perspective. In particular, I'd like you to think about how the stories, or probably more accurately, the experiences, were designed across multiple platforms. What I mean by that is that transmedia experiences often use at least two different ways or mediums to tell each part of the story. Now, a couple of things to pick up on at this point. This approach is not about duplicating a story or experience. So, for example, if a film is made which is based on a book, this is not transmedia. It's just duplication over two different mediums. Instead, a transmedia approach uses different mediums or different media platforms to tell different aspects of a story. In this way, different types of people or audiences can be accessed by the experienced designers. And here's the tricky part. If it's done well, if it's designed well, someone should be able to access as many or as few dimensions of the experience as they wish, without losing a sense of entertainment and engagement and, of course, enjoyment. So, for example, it would have been perfectly possible for some people to have watched the film only of Pandemic 1.0 at Sundance and simply stop at that. And their experience of watching the film would be hopefully positive and entertaining, and even if they didn't like the film, it would not have been for the reason of confusion or feeling that somehow it just doesn't make sense. The film itself is a complete experience, but at the same time is one dimension of a wider experience. So, at the same time, it would have been perfectly possible for people to take part in Pandemic 1.0 reality game at Sundance without watching the film. Now, hopefully by watching the film, people would have been motivated to participate in the game, but maybe not, and that's fine. Transmedia is also about recognising that people's demographics and other more subtle individual characteristics that make us human tend to influence different levels of engagement with different media platforms. Remember our explorations of the millennial generation in the last unit, how they've been brought up with a tablet in their hands? Well, this will influence a whole generation's preference of entertainment format as a fairly crude demographic. As a younger generation, I wonder how many of you actually watch TV. Much more subtle individualities also have an influence. Why, for example, might you enjoy reading books but don't really like going to the cinema, or maybe you really, really enjoy graphic novels but don't enjoy TV. Whatever platform it is that you favour is sometimes an individual choice. The second thing I want to pick up on here is about the multiple platform approach of transmedia, and it's the purpose of each dimension of the story that drives the choice of platform. In other words, the designer starts off with the story. That is the main focal point with the experience. He or she asks, what is it we are trying to achieve here? And who is it that we're trying to captivate? What is the purpose of this dimension? And it is this that drives the choice of platform. Say, for example, you've created sort of murder mystery reality game experience, and you're aiming for people in their 20s to play. That's your market. Maybe you want to describe how the murder unfolds in real time and in detail from the perspective of the murderer. So, you might, for example, choose to create a fictitious online Twitter account where the murderer tweets how he is stalking his victim in every detail. You would not, though, as a game designer, think, oh, well, I think creating a Twitter account would be really fun and really cool. How could we use that in the story? Instead, it is the purpose of the experience dimension, the story, that drives the choice of platform. That's important. So what I'd like to do now is just to reflect on what I've been talking about before we move on to our final part of this unit, because, well, I've thrown quite a lot of things at you. So take a break before you dive into the next part, where we're going to be returning to be looking at gamification a lot more closely. See you later.